You're listening to the Cash Flow Academy podcast with Andy Tanner, your source for investing made easy. Here's Andy Tanner.
Welcome to the Cash Flow Academy podcast. This is where we do our very best to make investing simple. I'm your host, Andy Tanner, and we have an interesting conversation with a very active guest. We have Philip Howard with us, who is the author of Not Accountable, Rethinking the Constitutionality of Public Employee Unions, among other books. He's also the founder of a group called commongood.org. This is a non-partisan organization, and he's very active in commenting and writing on public policy, common sense, which is often not found in Washington, so he's got plenty of work to do. So first of all, Philip, thank you for being on the program with us.
Yeah, it's great to be with you, Andy.
You know, generally when our podcast is the Cash Flow Academy podcast, it's about developing cash flow. So, why would I seek out and be very grateful to have Philip with us, where he's writing on, policy or even politics. Because you guys know me, I run from politics all the time. It's it's not something that's in my purview as often as maybe it should be. However, policy effects on how things work. I've often said policy and demographics will give you the future. For example, monetary policy is very, very political, and monetary policy through the Fed and the Treasury, it shapes our world. And in my book that I wrote many, many years ago, 401 Chaos, I talked about 401ks. And in my re-release, in my second edition, I decided to tell a story that I think will give background for why I think Philip's work is important. A lot of people don't know that the the 401k, that is the predominant retirement system in America, was born because of union activity. Now, it wasn't public union. It was the United Auto Worker Union. And if people want to read the story, they can find it very easily. But the Studebaker Company was going out of business. And the unions came to the negotiation table, and the corporation, Studebaker, said, look, we just can't afford this. We cannot afford these exorbitant pensions that you guys are. They called it a second gold rush in the papers. The unions became so powerful, particularly the United Auto Worker Union. And they didn't care, and they crushed the Studebaker Company. It was interesting because they used that example as a reason to begin negotiating with Congress. And they said, look, we need the taxpayers to shoulder the burden of our retirements, because we can't guarantee that corporations can always be solvent. So this was really tough, because they were just beating the heck out of the Studebaker Company on one hand, and on the other hand, they said, well, let's make our collective bargaining even more powerful, because if we can get the taxpayers to back our pensions, and this ERISA was born, the Employee Retirement Income Security Act. Within that, the Public Benefit Guarantee Corporation was formed, and now we had this policy where that's still around today. In fact, the last time it was increased was under President Obama, where corporations now have to pay a premium to insure their workers, and thus they choose 401ks rather than pensions. So with that long introduction, if we don't learn from the past, we're destined to repeat those mistakes. And I guess the big thing is these unions can corrupt a democratic process, and yet, corporations also corrupt it. This battle between labor and management is huge. So with that background, I'd like to introduce Philip Howard in his book, Not Accountable, Rethinking the Constitutionality of Public Employee Unions. So that's kind of a longer-winded setup and introduction than I normally give, but I think it's important for people to know that policy does affect, the cash flow that comes into your pocket through taxes, and also through what you're able to do through competition as an entrepreneur and to be aware of as an investor. So first of all, give us a little bit of your background. You and I have something in common. Your father was a man of the cloth, I guess we could say, a minister. My father was the same. And start there. And how did you wind up becoming so interested in public policy?
Well, I grew up in Eastern Kentucky in a bunch of small towns. I got scholarships to Eastern schools, and then in the summers I had a break. I became the sort of gopher to a Nobel Prize winner at the Oak Ridge National Lab for 3 summers, and I ended up writing papers on post-nuclear war recovery, which was the subject, but it was policy. And I got out of school, and I couldn't really figure out a good job that was focused on policy, so I did what many people in my situation do, is I became a lawyer by default. And then, while doing that, became active in civic work. I moved to New York. And then when doing the civic work, I kept asking myself, why does government work so badly? And particularly, I had friends at that point in responsible positions in government, and I was curious why they couldn't do what they thought made sense. And I started looking into it just out of curiosity, and it ended up being a book. The book was called The Death of Common Sense in the mid-1990s, and it became, the big bestseller of the year. And so who knew? And since then, I've advised every presidential administration, and, I get involved in various reforms, testified before Congress a lot. I've been very involved in infrastructure permitting, for example. But I think there's a bigger problem in Washington. It really does affect everyone's bottom lines, which we can talk about. And I think it's going to take bigger changes than either party is willing to give us.
It is an interesting conundrum. As I've done my writing, I've been very critical of the 401k program because of how it came about. There was never a think tank or a brain trust of smart women and men that got together and said, hey, let's do something great for these workers. Let's do something great for retirement. It was really a lot of people in their own self-interest. It started with the union's interest in ERISA, starting the corporation's interest of wanting to get rid of that situation. Ted Bennett was trying to serve the corporations. And government, I think I'm safe to say this without being too political, government cares about one thing, and that's votes. And that's a big problem when you have a very strong block of interest that can help you get those votes. Is that a good place to start with this problem?
Yeah. So the problem that I identify in this new book, which is the public employee unions, they're actually different than trade unions. Trade unions, if they negotiate for too much, as in the Studebaker situation, they'll lose their jobs.
Yeah.
The company will either move out of town or it'll go out of business. With public employee unions, government can't move out of town; it's stuck there.
Yeah.
Nor can it go out of business. So what's happened? This is a relatively recent phenomenon. They only got collective bargaining powers in the public employee union in the late 1960s, really with nobody even noticing. It was just a political payback thing. But what's happened is for 50 years, these unions have demanded more and more and more, so that the taxpayers are paying for things. Well, they're doing two things. They're not getting the services they deserve because government has become more or less literally unmanageable.
Yeah.
There's zero accountability. I mean, by zero, I mean one 18-year study in Illinois, 2 out of 95,000 teachers a year were dismissed for performance over an 18-year period. So we're talking about like 0.01%. And there's no manageability. They negotiate for work rules that are literally designed for inefficiency. Some transit crew is out fixing the track. There's an overhanging branch. They're not allowed to cut off the branch. A separate crew has to come in under the work rules, that sort of thing. So they're designed for feather bedding, and so studies suggest that services cost 2 to 3 times what they would in the private sector because of the feather bedding. Well, that's a lot of money.
Well, when you look at CalPERS in California, when you look at the disaster in Kentucky, and the teachers' pensions that they gave all their money to Wall Street. They gave us some hedge funds, and those guys took all their money via fees. And you look at Illinois and other states that are having these problems. This looms large on a state balance sheet, and as you mentioned, the revenue that is demanded, I'll say that rather than earned. Companies earn revenue. States demand it by a declaration. This is how much of your money we're going to take. It puts a heavy burden on many of these states' balance sheets, and federal government gets away with this because they can print money and they can, they have no real debt ceiling. But is it different for states? And can you talk about the difference between what happens at the state level and the federal level? Big question, but I know there's a lot there, but I'll let you unpack it.
Yeah, I mean, so over 50 years, these public employee unions have negotiated for things that the public couldn't really see. So they didn't negotiate for much higher salaries. They negotiated for, again, feather bedding work rules and pensions and health benefits that are way out of the ordinary. So in New York City, there's zero contribution for health care to the public employees. In L.A., recently, teachers and service workers went on strike. There's zero contribution by the retirees, the teacher retirees, to health care. If they simply were accessing Medicare, the way that would free up enough money to given the service workers, like the bus drivers and stuff, who had gone on strike, a $7,000 a year raise. But of course, they won't consider it. So you have states, and again, Kentucky, Illinois, some others that have compounded the problem by not reserving for it.
Yeah.
They make these promises, but they don't do what would be required of a business. And I think the number in Illinois is that the public debt per family for the state unfunded pension is something like $65,000.
This is important.
Every family owes the Illinois pensioners $65,000.
This is really, really important because as you look at this on, let's talk about the federal level, is I don't believe personally that in the United States, and we have a very global audience, so this affects, about a third of our students are from outside the United States, but this is the same all over the world. It's power, it's, politics. But what is interesting is when I say policy and demographics gives you the future, what I mean by that is, policy is the set of rules we live by. And the demographics, there's a number of people moving along through time. And it creates a sort of time bomb, really, because we can count how many people are going to retire and want these benefits. And we can add up via policy what we owe them. And what I don't think most people, at least in the members of the electorate in the United States realize is you hear once in a while about a $32-33 trillion debt. Well, those are funded. Those they sell bonds and they have funds from the debt. Those are funded, but they have not received any funds for the promises they made. There's a huge difference between borrowed money and promised money. And if people would just take a moment to realize the amount of promised money at the federal level and at the state level, at least in the United States, it's in the hundreds of trillions. It's not a trillion, it's over 100 trillion with a gross domestic product of, say, mid-20s if we don't have a recession. So this is a piece of the puzzle I see. And you and I might have, I really enjoy bringing on guests where I might differ. And I give you the nod, and I think your work is noble. It's a noble work to fight for what you believe. But my opinion is that this is not fixable systemically. That the government problems are so severe, so entrenched. I'd like you to comment on the extreme behavior that this stuff causes. That I really think that the stance I've taken with me and my family is I've got to prepare as an individual in my life. I can't trust the public. I can't risk hoping that the public works things out. I've got to prepare as an individual. So my writings are more of what do you do as an individual, maybe as opposed to try to change policy.
Yeah, I think that's very. I think you're being realistic. So just to be clear, this new book, Not Accountable, argues that public employee unions have preempted democracy. We elect mayors and governors who actually don't have the authority to run the operating machinery of government, and therefore should be unconstitutional. I'm making a constitution so the Supreme Court can solve this problem. I've already had one appellate court. The book's only out 2 months. Already had one citing my book repeatedly in an opinion. So this particular problem, I have identified a constitutional solution for, and so we'll see what. I'm in the process of trying to organize the lawsuits. But the larger problem, the irresponsibility and ineptitude of modern government, I think you're absolutely correct, is embedded in these legacy bureaucracies and defended by tens of thousands of interest groups. And so I'm actually hosting a forum at Columbia on empowering human agency, where I've got several Nobel Prize winners, leading philosophers, all coming together saying just what you said, which is that we can't get there from here. The current system cannot, you can elect a new leader, they don't have the power to lead it, and Washington is itself encased in kind of legal amber. Yeah. It's never going to make these changes. So the only way we're ever going to get something good happening is if it's going to be pressure from the outside, and it's got to be not a vague pressure, but a pressure for a very specific new governing structure that actually allows people to take responsibility and be accountable, to act, to give a permit for a transmission line, to fire the lousy teacher, all those things. And by the way, because government is working ineptly at best half capacity, you're talking about $2 trillion a year just in employee salaries, public employees. 22 million people work for the government in this country, most state and local, and they're unmanageable. So how much waste is there in there? The studies suggest that it's 2 to 3x. So what's needed is to build probably a new party, but a movement based on giving back to people scraping away these legacy bureaucracies and not getting rid of government, but keeping the goals that are important, let's say environmental protection, but not making them require 10-year permitting processes, letting people make decisions, clear lines of authority, clear lines of accountability. Let's just get going again.
It does seem interesting that any position of leadership, whether you're going to be the head of a department chair, let's say you're the department chair of the mathematics departments at your local high school, or let's say you're the principal, or let's say you're administrator, or let's say you're a mayor. These policies are legacy policies. And so really, if you are lucky to get elected, right after the inauguration, they handcuff you to these legacies anyway. And people bash people bash teachers a lot. It's been my experience that if you take a group of 1,000 people at random, and then whatever you want to do, take 1,000 attorneys, there'll be some good ones and some bad ones. You take 1,000 pastors, there'll be some good ones and some bad ones. You take 1,000 school teachers, there'll be some good ones and some bad ones. And certainly these policies do as much damage to the person who really wants to teach and really loves their job and has a passion for helping the youth. This kills them as much because there is so much red tape. They're not allowed to do their job. There's so much policy and rules. They're really not allowed the freedom to teach the kids anyway. And so it is.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. I mean, I've written a bunch of books about this, but the worst thing, for example, about no accountability, which, because of the union controls, is it destroys the mutual trust needed to have an energetic, department with pride, or an energetic school, because everybody knows performance doesn't matter. So why should you go the extra mile?
Exactly.
It's just so dispiriting.
Exactly. I went to school in public school as a kid, and that's 50 years ago now. Can't believe I can say that. I started kindergarten 50 years ago. But I go back and I work as a volunteer. I coach my kids' team, and I get a good sense of what the rules are for attendance. I get a good sense for what the culture is in terms of getting assignments in on time. Now, I got to tell you, it's a different world than when I went to school, and what you can say and what you can't say and what a teacher can say. Teachers, boy, they got to watch themselves in many instances, and it's hard for them to discipline a student without being a bully. It's hard for them to hold them accountable, to say, hey, here's an assignment and it's due. I mean, we never got to retake tests. We never got to say, I'll turn my assignment in when I want to. It's my choice. And yet that's what I see in the schools. It's an amazing thing. So what does a person do? Because what I see this building to is, certainly I'd love to have good schools. And I don't know, I think it's more of a parent responsibility to prepare their son for life than the school system or daughter. I hang out a bit with Robert Kiyosaki, and he bashes teachers. I bash parents mostly, because I think it's the parents' job. Why is it a school teacher's job to prepare my children for life? That's my job. So I'm a little bit more, I chew out parents a lot. But be that as that may, what I think is interesting is that the situation that's been built in terms of unfunded liability, to me, I think that will eventually cause a collapse of states and governments. I just don't see how you can perpetually keep. I mean, it's going to be like the Studebaker Company, right? I mean, do you agree? I see things like this. The reason I want to be in the know is less about my belief I can change it, but more about I need to prepare for revolution. And that sounds extreme, but I don't think it's too extreme when I look at our government and what's happening right now at federal and state levels. I mean, I think they're extreme. Am I being too bombastic and conspiracy theory and all that? No. You have the correct sense that we're driving very fast towards a cliff, and some of the states like Illinois and Kentucky are worse than others. I was talking to the historian Neil Ferguson, you know who I mean, and he's a well-known columnist for Bloomberg the other day, and we were talking about it, and he views the dysfunction of these legacy bureaucracies and how they handcuff everybody, as you were saying. He views it as a national security problem. Yeah. That if we have schools that don't work, and we have states that are functionally bankrupt, and we pay twice as much for trash collection as the private carters would charge, eventually all that, weakens you.
Weakens you and becomes unsustainable. So my view is that we ought to not wait for the revolution, but actually start our own kind of centrist revolution, and sort of a new vision of where the governing principle is human responsibility and accountability, but requires completely remaking the legal frameworks that tie everybody in knots all day long. You can't fix it. It would take you 10,000 lifetimes to prune the jungle. They need to be replaced. And so that's what I'm trying at commongood.org. That's what we're trying to first build a leadership group and then begin to attract citizens behind it.
See, I think the difficulty is when you deal with policy is you can, it's the same the way, if you have a company, for example, in my small company, I really don't know that I can buy a person's back, but I can try to win their heart. And I think that's what great organizations are about. When I was a lousy basketball player, but I played on a pretty good college basketball team. So as an individual, I was pretty lousy, but as a team, we were pretty good. And I think, it's culture. And we never had a lot of rules and policy because we were inspired to win by our coach. And I think that's the difficulty when we elect leaders is we don't have cultural strength because it doesn't matter if you have laws and policy. It's if people want to be good. You cannot legislate goodness. It's either in a person's heart or it's not. And I think we've just got a world of hurt in front of us.
Right.
The book is Not Accountable, Rethinking the Constitutionality of Public Employee Unions. My guest is Philip Howard. He also has the organization nonpartisan commongood.org. And I think common good and things like that help the culture. I just don't know that we have enough participation in that. Can you comment on the culture versus the politics? You talk about personal responsibility. Look, don't try to run for president. I get on my soapbox and I tend to repeat myself in saying, I can't run for office because the things I say in my house, I would be stoned in the streets for saying outside my house. Like I tell my kids, stand on your own 2 feet. There's no free lunch. Pull your own weight around here. Be responsible. Serve, and the worst one, this is the worst one I tell my kids that you could never get elected. I say, hey, don't ask what this country can do for you. Ask what you can do for this country. You say that, you'd never get elected, right?
Right. The culture is a problem. But I would say, most people that I know, and probably are responsible. Most people probably do stand on their own 2 feet, et cetera. But the one thing that our culture doesn't do is it hasn't gotten involved in the public sector. We see the problems you're talking about, and we kind of complain about it, but we complain about it and thinking that somebody else is going to do something.
Yeah.
And so I would say that the biggest impediment to fixing what's wrong with America is our affluence. Is it people have just become, sort of fat and lazy. I mean, all of us, right? It's just human nature. So we don't feel the imperative to go out and band with others and say, we've got to fix this. We keep saying somebody ought to fix it, without looking in the mirror. So I do think there's a significant cultural problem there. I mean, whenever I give talks, and I give talks many different groups of judges and lots of, people, I'm not pushing on a closed door. People are very responsive. They see the problems that you're talking about. They see that things need to change, but they don't have a sense that they should be involved in it. And I think that's a real cultural problem.
Boy, that's a really good critique of perhaps myself. When I think about it, that's an excellent critique to say, hey, Andy, don't quit, because I look at it and I think it's not worth the time. I guess I get disheartened when I see how long. I remember when David Walker, the Comptroller of the General United States, head of the GAO, packed up, great nonpartisan guy, by the way, worked for both Democratic and Republican administrations, probably equally. And he packed up his office and he said, I'm not doing this anymore. And he went out like an Old Testament prophet, doing the best he could to give speeches saying, hey, we're in huge fiscal trouble with this stuff. We got to get it fixed. So I thank you guys like you, Philip Howard. Again, Amazon.com, you can get Not Accountable, Rethinking the Constitutionality of Public Employee Unions. And I don't really care whether a person is a Democrat or Republican or a libertarian or an independent. Be able to read what other people have to say without judgment, and then become informed and then make your opinions on how you want to behave. Anything you would say to listeners in terms of preparation?
Yeah, I mean, we're looking to build active efforts to fix problems. So if people go to commongood.org, it's free. They can sign up, newsletters. Then some of your listeners will have ideas of who might be able to be a good person to bring a lawsuit on the union situation. They might have access to someone running for office who could adopt a kind of spring cleaning of the bureaucratic state, which is what's needed, kind of platform. I'm talking to some of the 2024 people aspiring to run for president right now to try to get them to talk about it. So, and people can do things in their local community. You can go into a school board or something and say, look, why don't we clean out a lot of these rules that have piled up? Nobody's cleaned them out ever.
Mm-hmm.
Let's clean them out. Let's give teachers and principals a little more room.
Yeah.
To make sense of things. So there are lots of things people can do, and we'd be happy to help them if they're interested. They can just get in touch with us.
Well, it's a fun website to see. Your advisory board is packed full. Your trustees are credible people. And so I'd encourage people to do what they can, both publicly and privately, to prepare. Hopefully publicly and systemically, we get together and we see the peril. I think one of the reasons I like having guys like you on my podcast is, we're pretty small, compared to like a Joe Rogan. We probably have about 50,000 downloads per episode, but it's a start. And if people can learn more about these problems and more importantly, where they head, right, where they lead, perhaps we can muster the ability as a society and as a community to make some changes and head it off. Or at least you can be more prepared as an individual. I don't think you ought to get a bunker, and I don't think you ought to, start hoarding, guns and ammunition and stuff like that. But I do think being prepared fiscally, being prepared as a family to endure some tough times in the next generation wouldn't hurt. So either way, pick up your copy of Not Accountable, Rethinking the Constitutionality of Public Employee Unions and the Problems Therein. With that, I just thank you and appreciate you. I hope you hang out just for a bit after I close the show so I can properly thank you for being our guest. You've been listening to Philip Howard on the Cashflow Academy podcast. We'll see you next time.
You've been listening to the Cashflow Academy podcast with Andy Tanner. For more information on investing made easy, go to thecashflowacademy.com.